trauma that I spoke of in the Atlantis books, with the enormous traumas that have happened from 50,000 years ago, and then moving up to 30,000, then moving up to 10,000, all the scholars have noticed that there's just been enormous cataclysms now. And this is finally coming out of the bag. Well, all of these cataclysms, people point to the physical consequences. I've always spoken about the psychic consequences of the coming of evil into the world, and also the creation, literally, of what we would call an interior life. Your ability to be able to think about stuff inside your head is an abnormality, by the way. It's something that didn't exist, in the blink of an eye in history, and it is very recent. It's a recent phenomenon. We're so used to it, we accept, there's the outer world, and then there's this little dialogue, that we have inside our brain. This is a completely artificial state. And I want people to really think about it. The interior life is new. It's modern. It came with the birth of the ego. And the ego is basically an idea creator. It creates ideas. And it doesn't create very rational or healthy ideas. And within the ego, you have innumerable ideas of things. But the most important idea that you have is an idea of yourself. And this idea of yourself is strengthened by everyone you come into contact with who sells you back some information about yourself. And it all gets stored in the memory banks so that we have this idea of who we are. But this idea of who we are is not the self. Like we said on the last show, your idea of an oak tree may not be, it is not an oak tree itself. But we are conditioned into believing that it is. I got a couple of quotes from Carl Jung. If I can read those, they'll probably make things a lot easier to understand.
Sure, go ahead.
And of course, he was one of the masters on this concept. He said that there was a time when rational present-day consciousness was not yet separated from the historical psyche, the collective unconscious. So he's talking about, again, it's recent. There was a time when there was no division. There was no unconscious and then conscious mind. He says, inasmuch as the ego is only the center of my field of consciousness, it is not identical with the totality of my psyche, being merely a complex among other complexes. Hence, I discriminate between the ego and the self, since the ego is only the subject of my consciousness, while the self is the subject of my totality. Hence, it also includes the unconscious psyche. In this sense, the self would be an ideal factor which embraces and includes the ego. The best way to think of it is like an egg. If you crack an egg open, you see the yellow part and then you see the white part. Well, that's what it is. The ego, in fact, the word ego comes from the word for egg. The two words come from the same word root.
Interesting.
Is like this little yellow, thing in the middle, and the consciousness is all of the egg, the totality of the egg, the complete egg. Now, we want to choose to live inside that one small area. But Jung goes on to say, it is certain that the original psyche possesses no consciousness of itself. Okay, so he's saying the primordial psyche way back. It didn't have any consciousness of itself. This only comes in the course of development. A development falls mostly within the historical epoch. Even today, we know of primitive tribes whose level of consciousness is not so far removed from the darkness of the primordial psyche. Nevertheless, its development so far has made it emancipated enough to forget its dependence upon the unconscious psyche. So what he's saying is that, you see, it's a very recent phenomenon, this birth of the ego. But it's long enough for the ego to delude itself into thinking that there's nothing else but its own reality. See, does that sound familiar? I mean, this is how the whole world operates, in which everyone thinks that they are the most important being on the earth. Governments think our country is the most important. You see, it all comes from the ego thinking that there's no other wider territory in the psyche.
So
that it inhabits this tower, and this tower exists, sort of floating there with no landscape. This is the kind of delusion that causes so many things to go wrong. And I can't overstate that this amputated ego, it did come about as a result of these earth traumas. So physical things caused this to happen. I mean, in the couple of the web streams I've done, I've got some brilliant quotes from some fantastic authors about this. I'd like to go through two or three of them because, want to really stress this. There was from a book by cellist Glendenning, Henrik, he quotes Terry Kellogg. He says that Terry Kellogg emphasizes the fact that abusive behaviors, whether we direct them to ourselves, other people, or other species, are not natural to human beings. People enact such behavior because, he says, something unnatural has happened to them. I and they have become deranged. Yeah. Then Jack Barringer, in his book Past Shock, which was a very big influence on my work, he says that Julian Jaynes, the author of The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, claimed that this period, thousands of years ago, was a time of intense psychosis for the emerging human race. So this is, again, Julian Jaynes was one of the top psychologists and brain specialists, one of the most academically superior intellects who discovered basically what I'm talking about here.
Yeah.
He goes on, Terence McKenna, the famous Terence McKenna, said that he was talking about Julian Jaynes. He said that Jaynes has suggested that human consciousness has changed its character even in historical times. The ego as we know it was not really in existence except under extreme stress. And then it presented itself almost as an exterior intrusion into consciousness, like the voice of a god. So here we have the scientists backing up this, theory that the ego that people wake up every day is an imposter. It's an extremely, it did a good thing. It kept us alive.
Yeah.
It is a remnant of the old consciousness, just like you can see water, the ocean. There's so many places have reclaimed land where they built dams and the ocean has pulled out, but you still get some marshy lands and some little ponds and pools.
Yeah.
I could think of the band Rush in their album Permanent Waves. They've got a song just exactly about this, that when the ocean pulls out, what's left is these tiny little microscopic pools of water with whole ecosystem. And in that ecosystem, you could be thinking that you're the whole ocean.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you get down close and look at it, it can be considered, you see shellfish, you see life going on in that little pool.
Yeah, sure.
But that little pool is not the whole ocean,
Yeah, exactly.
This is a situation in which we have ourselves,
Yes, as you say, the ego, it's not very old. It's a very recent creation, then, historically speaking. And I mean, is it that we, have not yet learned to, deal with this? I mean, so is this part of the problem, so to speak?
Yes, it's very much. You see, it's like the tower card in the tarot cards. You pick out number 16, and you see this very disturbed tower. The ego is moving this way and that way in the wind. It's not on firm foundations. You cannot put anything on a slanty foundation, a wonky foundation, and hope that it's going to grow straight.
Yeah.
So as the ego progresses, the ego thinks, hey, fantastic, years are going by, I'm in control. But the thing is that for every new layer that the ego puts on, it's getting more and more and more, tilting like the Leaning Tower of Pisa problem, because the foundation from the beginning was not straight. And the ego has never dealt with that foundation. It's just kept building and building and building.
Yeah.
And, now we have I look at Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings, the movie, the book, that's what the Dark Lord is. Sauron, the Dark Lord, standing and living in his tower there, is exactly that. He is the ego.
Yeah.
He is basically the form of the ego that literally wants to be so exclusive and dominate and dominate and dominate. That's partly, I think, what that story is all about. It's a tremendous rendering of this crisis. And, we have a situation in which people now are, imprisoned in this tower.
Yeah.
The self is very different. The self is a very different kind of thing. One of the other problems that we have, you see, in dealing with the ego is that we waste a lot of chi. The ego is a living thing. And the ego realizes that in order to sustain its life, having peace and calm and quiet and a loving environment doesn't help the ego. Because if you have a very, very peaceful, environment and a peaceful kind of life without a lot of mayhem, people will then slowly start gravitating back to nature, start asking the big questions. They will start to think metaphysically. They will take care of their bodies, you see, and they'll become very, very spiritualized people. So this natural. Human beings become like that naturally if things are provided, in a good way. If you watch the movie Lost Horizons, the original black and white movie, that's exactly what they show you, that even a bunch of pretty tyrannous people, if they're brought into a beautiful, surroundings, like a monastery or a lamasery, they actually, completely drop all their evil ways. So the ego, realizing that, oh my God, if that happens, I might be put out of business, people will start asking, who is God? What's the bigger question?
Yeah.
So the ego has all the chaos and havoc going on in the world and in our lives perpetually. Every day there's something to troubleshoot. Constant conflict, constant, upheaval, constant domestic minutia to get involved with.
I mean, is it too far then to say that, this is the ego is a form of, psychic cancer, like a parasite that is, trying to sustain itself on us?
And in fact, in many Star Treks and in many, Twilight Zones, this is exactly how the great science fiction writers have portrayed the mind, as some sort of demonic child, who plays with its toys and is completely out of control, who acts, like a small dwarf behind the screen. Yeah, it's a precarious, crazy, tyrannical, very, very, very brilliant thing as well.
Yeah.
But the problems, it's pathological. It has a very severe issue that in order to perpetuate its own existence, it uses what we would call conflict. So when you're observing conflict in your life next time, even if it's just driving the car or going to get the shopping, or, you hear about the conflicts of other people, or conflict here, there's conflict there, you have conflict with the neighbors, you have conflict with the builders, the contractors, oh my goodness, there's conflict at work, oh, I just had this argument with, some guy who came in.
Yeah.
My goodness, all this perpetual conflict on level after level, of tier after tier after tier.
Yeah.
Is actually by design. It's there because the ego gets a booster out of that. And same with flexing a muscle when you're weight training. It's the friction of the, movement.
Yeah.
The peristalsis of the movement that creates the blood to flow to build up the muscle.
Yeah,
so the ego is nothing but a psychic muscle, and it breeds on conflict. And of course, what does that do for us? It wastes a lot of our life energy, a lot of our chi, which goes into troubleshooting a life full of conflict. Is, of course, the famous stressed life that everyone's living, and nobody knows how to take it back to the problem of the ego, this constant thing. And then, of course, when the trouble gets really bad, then the ego comes along and goes, oh, I'll help you. We got gurus. Remember last time we were talking about the branches of the inauthentic life?
Yeah, sure.
Starting from the guilt complex itself, and one of them was, renovation. You hate the life you're living, but just try to decorate it better.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, this is where the gurus come in. Of course, the ego knows that it's got this chaotic office, that this house is just absolutely in disarray, like something out of Lewis Carroll, So what does it do? It brings in the super organizers to take care of it all. Not to take you out of the tower, but to decorate the tower, to move the furniture around, to say, oh, we'll streamline this place for you. It's like this fanatical obsession that they have now with TV programs about, fixing your house up.
Yeah.
Where you go to work for, 12 hours and suddenly you come back and they've painted polka dots all over your house. Well, this is what the ego does. It goes, we'll lay on the gurus.
Yeah.
We got techniques and paths, and we'll really, make this luxurious. We know you don't like it living, like a serf, a coal miner in this totally horrible building.
Yeah.
So we will, we'll super organize your whole inner architecture, and that'll be brilliant.
Yeah, short-term solutions. That seems to be popular at the moment. Yeah. And
the other thing we need to realize is very, very important about the ego. Before we finish about the ego, is that what we call myth and what we call history is the ego taking notes. Just as you keep a journal about your day-to-day existence. Well, the ego has been keeping a journal from the moment of its inception, and that journal is mythology.
Yeah.
So when people say, oh, all the characters seem to be the same, all over the world, the mythological, the hero with 1,000 faces, the sun king, the sun god, even the scenarios are almost identical. Well, it's the same author. Everyone has got one thing in common all over the world, a brain, an ego.
Yeah.
So if you think about it, and it's quite a concept to think about, but Joseph Campbell sort of expressed this a little, we have to understand that there is a diary being kept as this ego progresses down through the millennium. And it's not a diary being kept by the soul, as people like Jung thought. It's not. It's a diary being kept by the ego to commemorate and memorialize its own movement, because the essence of the ego is narcissism. So, the only thing that the ego cares about is itself. So it wanted to memorialize its own trek down through the ages, and that diary is mythology.
So could it be that we unconsciously are recreating these